Black Lives Matter and the broader network of aligned black organizations constitute a coordinated domestic terrorist and criminal enterprise operating within the United States. This network functions through decentralized yet unified structures that enable sustained violence, financial fraud, legislative subversion, and institutional infiltration. Its activities extend far beyond isolated incidents to form a persistent campaign of racial hostility directed primarily against white Americans and the foundational institutions of the country. The enterprise raises vast sums under charitable pretenses, diverts resources for personal and ideological gain, and mobilizes repeated waves of disruption to coerce policy changes that weaken law enforcement and transfer power along racial lines. The organization's names and core ideology openly declare racial prioritization. Terms such as Black Lives Matter and repeated emphasis on Black First frameworks establish an explicit bias that frames white Americans as the source of oppression. This bias manifests in rhetoric calling for the dismantling of whiteness, the imposition of collective white guilt, and the decentering of white people in all spheres of society. Such language is not peripheral but central to the movement's identity, providing the motivational foundation for both overt violence and subtler forms of institutional sabotage. The network's ability to coordinate across coalitions, fiscal sponsors, and re-granting mechanisms allows it to sustain operations while distributing risk and maintaining operational continuity. This enterprise has demonstrated a clear pattern of escalation. What begins with public mobilization evolves into riots producing billions in property damage, assaults on law enforcement, and autonomous zones that reject lawful authority. Financial crimes involving wire fraud, money laundering, and embezzlement supplement these efforts, while legislative and corporate alliances embed anti-white policies through DEI mandates and racial quotas. The cumulative effect is a domestic insurgency that exploits civil rights frameworks to achieve racial advantage, displacing white Americans from employment and influence while expanding its own power. The full scope of this threat requires recognition of the network as a domestic terrorist and criminal organization whose activities demand comprehensive legal response. Definitions of terrorism and domestic terrorism. Terrorism consists of the calculated use of violence, threats, and intimidation to create fear in a population and coerce political or ideological change. Black Lives Matter and aligned organizations employ precisely these methods through sustained campaigns of disruption that generate widespread fear and force governmental concessions on policing, economics, and racial policy. The 2020 riots, with billions in insured damages, hundreds of assaults on officers, and widespread arson and looting, exemplify this calculated approach. The organization's decentralized structure allows repeated mobilization under a shared brand, ensuring continuous pressure while limiting centralized accountability. This strategy maximizes impact by blending overt violence with ideological messaging that frames white Americans and American institutions as legitimate targets. The network's ability to rapidly regenerate after periods of relative calm demonstrates a sophisticated terrorist model that adapts to political conditions while maintaining long-term objectives of racial transformation and institutional dismantling. Every act of destruction serves the dual purpose of immediate intimidation and long-term power consolidation. Domestic terrorism under federal definitions involves acts dangerous to human life that violate criminal laws and intend to intimidate civilian populations or influence government conduct through coercion. The network's activities fully satisfy these criteria. Riots and autonomous zones created environments of fear designed to compel policy shifts such as defunding police and implementing race-based redistribution. Financial schemes support these operations by providing resources for further mobilization. The ideological commitment to anti-white hostility and institutional dismantling supplies the clear motive that transforms ordinary crimes into components of a domestic terrorist campaign. The organizations have refined this approach over years, learning from past cycles of unrest that insufficient accountability leads to bolder future actions. By combining street-level violence with institutional infiltration, the network achieves sustained coercive pressure that ordinary criminal activity could never accomplish. The decentralized yet ideologically unified structure functions as an effective terrorist apparatus capable of nationwide coordination without exposing a single command center to full legal scrutiny. The networked nature of the enterprise enhances its effectiveness as a domestic terrorist force. Coalitions like the Movement for Black Lives, fiscal sponsors, and re-granting systems create an infrastructure that sustains violence, fraud, and subversion across multiple jurisdictions. This structure enables the organizations to function as a distributed terrorist network capable of rapid escalation when political conditions permit. The absence of sufficient past accountability has only emboldened further expansion, demonstrating the urgent need for designation under domestic terrorism frameworks. Each wave of activity builds upon the previous one, with financial gains from one campaign funding the next cycle of disruption. The ideological training and radicalization pipelines within the network ensure a continuous supply of participants ready to engage in coercive actions. This self-reinforcing system turns isolated crimes into components of a larger terrorist strategy aimed at eroding the constitutional order and displacing white Americans from positions of influence. The persistent nature of these operations across decades reveals a deliberate long-term campaign rather than spontaneous expressions of grievance. Constitutional and legal frameworks. The U.S. Constitution addresses internal threats through provisions on treason, insurrection, and domestic violence. Black Lives Matter and aligned organizations engage in activities that align with levying war against the constitutional order through sustained challenges to law enforcement and the creation of zones where governmental authority is forcibly replaced. Their ideological drive to dismantle core institutions and replace them with race-based alternatives constitutes a form of internal subversion that undermines the republic. The Guarantee Clause obligates federal protection against such domestic violence, yet selective enforcement has allowed the network to persist and expand. This constitutional failure has permitted the organizations to operate with increasing boldness, using periods of relative calm to rebuild capacity and plan future escalations. The pattern of creating parallel authority structures in autonomous zones directly challenges the sovereignty of the United States and the equal application of law to all citizens. By rejecting lawful governance in favor of racially defined control, the network engages in a form of insurrection that the Constitution explicitly anticipates and requires federal action to suppress. The Insurrection Act provides authority for federal intervention when ordinary law enforcement cannot contain widespread unrest. The scale of disruption during Black Lives Matter campaigns, including billions in damage and assaults on officers, triggered this authority. The network's ongoing readiness to repeat such campaigns when politically advantageous demonstrates the necessity of stronger application of constitutional powers to restore order. Financial crimes and institutional infiltration further erode the rule of law, requiring comprehensive federal response. The repeated failure to invoke these powers has signaled weakness that the organizations exploit, using each unpunished cycle to expand their influence and radicalize new generations of participants. The combination of physical violence, financial subversion, and legislative pressure creates a multi-domain assault on constitutional governance that demands decisive executive action. Without consistent enforcement of the Insurrection Act, the network will continue to test the limits of federal tolerance and push toward greater levels of disruption. Criminal statutes on organized enterprise, fraud, and hate crimes supply additional tools. Wire fraud, money laundering, and diversion of charitable funds by leaders and chapters form a continuing criminal enterprise. Hate crime enhancements apply because the organization's explicit anti-white bias supplies the required racial motivation for every offense. Membership in these groups establishes documented animus that transfers to individual crimes, justifying enhancements across riot violence, fraud, and institutional sabotage. The full weight of RICO-style provisions must be brought to bear on the network structure that coordinates these activities across jurisdictions. Financial terrorism through fraudulent charitable operations supports the broader terrorist objectives by providing resources for violence and institutional capture. The integration of hate crime enhancements with enterprise prosecutions would address both the racial motivation and the organized nature of the criminality. Past leniency has created a dangerous precedent that now threatens the stability of the republic. Comprehensive application of these legal frameworks is essential to dismantle the enterprise and prevent further escalation of domestic terrorism. Criminal activities and patterns of conduct. The Black Lives Matter riots represent the most visible and destructive expression of the network's criminality. These events produced billions of dollars in insured property damage through widespread arson, looting, assaults on law enforcement officers, and the deliberate destruction of businesses and public infrastructure. The violence was not random or spontaneous, but followed the organization's ideological blueprint that framed law enforcement, commercial enterprise, and symbols of ordered society as instruments of white supremacy requiring forceful confrontation. Every burned building, every looted store, and every assaulted officer served the larger goal of generating fear among the civilian population and coercing governments into adopting policies that weakened policing and advanced racial redistribution. The creation of autonomous zones during these campaigns constituted direct rejection of constitutional authority, where self-appointed groups seized territory, expelled police, and replaced lawful governance with their own rule. These zones operated as temporary liberated territories that demonstrated the network's willingness and capacity to challenge sovereign power through sustained intimidation and force. Financial crimes form a parallel and equally critical pillar of the enterprise's operations. Tens of millions of dollars raised under the Black Lives Matter banner through charitable appeals were systematically diverted through wire fraud, money laundering, self-dealing, and embezzlement by leaders and local chapters. These schemes exploited non-profit status to extract resources from the American public, disproportionately white donors and taxpayers, and redirect them toward personal enrichment and the funding of further anti-white ideological activities. The networked regranting system across coalitions and fiscal sponsors distributes these illicit gains while maintaining layers of separation that complicate accountability. This financial criminality is not incidental but integral to sustaining the broader enterprise, providing the capital necessary for continued mobilization, propaganda, and institutional infiltration. The pattern of fraud reveals a continuing criminal enterprise that uses the appearance of charity to mask systematic theft and resource extraction in service of racial warfare. Institutional crimes extend the criminal enterprise deep into the fabric of American society. DEI mandates, racial quotas, critical race theory programs, and diversity initiatives pushed by the network in alliance with investment firms and advocacy organizations have systematically displaced white workers to create protected positions and advancement tracks for black individuals. These policies constitute financial and institutional terrorism that extracts economic opportunity from white Americans and transfers it along explicitly racial lines. The same organizations responsible for street-level violence now occupy influential positions in corporations, government agencies, and educational institutions, where they enforce anti-white frameworks under the language of equity and inclusion. This long-term strategy of institutional capture demonstrates the enterprise's deliberate progression from overt riots to permanent structural dominance. The pattern of expansion from episodic violence to entrenched criminal control across multiple sectors reveals a sophisticated, multi-layered criminal organization whose activities threaten the foundational principles of merit, equal protection, and constitutional governance. The full scope of these crimes demands enterprise-wide prosecution rather than isolated individual charges. Anti-white hostility and expanding threat. Black organizations openly express profound hostility toward white people through terminology and ideology that frames whiteness itself as a pathology that must be dismantled. Concepts such as collective white guilt, white fragility, white silence as violence, and the urgent need to decenter white people in every institution permeate their platforms, training materials, and public discourse. This hostility is not rhetorical flourish but the foundational operating logic of the enterprise. It justifies violence against white-associated symbols, exclusion of white individuals from opportunities, and the extraction of resources as legitimate reparative actions. The bias is structural, embedded in organizational names that prioritize black identity while positioning white Americans as perpetual oppressors. Every criminal act committed under this ideological umbrella carries explicit anti-white motivation that satisfies the requirements for hate crime enhancements and domestic terrorism designations. The threat posed by this network expands in direct proportion to its growth in numbers, funding, and institutional penetration. Past leniency toward riot violence and financial crimes has created a clear precedent of impunity that encourages ever bolder escalation. As these organizations accumulate more power through captured positions in government, corporations, and education, their demands intensify and their tactics grow more aggressive. What once manifested as marches has evolved into sustained riots, then into permanent criminal networks and institutional control. This trajectory follows a logical historical pattern in which racially cohesive movements, once reaching critical mass, increase pressure to expel or subordinate other racial groups. In the American context, this means intensified campaigns against white citizens through both direct violence when conditions allow and relentless institutional sabotage during periods of relative calm. The organizations maintain readiness for renewed physical terrorism, preserving networks, radicalizing supporters, and planning future waves of disruption whenever political opportunities arise. The enterprise functions as a domestic terrorist army conducting sustained, multi-domain warfare against white Americans and the constitutional order of the United States. Its members, supporters, funders, and ideological allies form an interconnected criminal network dedicated to racial power consolidation at the expense of the founding population. This threat permeates every level of society, from street-level violence to elite financial terrorism and legislative subversion. The failure to address past crimes has only emboldened the network, creating a cycle of escalating demands and hostility that will continue until confronted with decisive force. Full designation of these organizations and their affiliates as domestic terrorists, combined with comprehensive prosecutions, asset forfeiture, hate crime enhancements, and systematic removal from positions of influence, represents the minimum necessary response. The survival of the nation and the protection of white Americans from this expanding racial insurgency require immediate and uncompromising action against the entire criminal enterprise. The evidence accumulated over years of violence, fraud, and institutional capture leaves no room for continued tolerance or selective enforcement. Black Lives Matter and the broader network of black organizations must be confronted as the domestic terrorist and criminal threat they have repeatedly proven themselves to be. Conclusion: the imperative to designate and dismantle Black Lives Matter as a domestic terrorist and criminal enterprise. Black Lives Matter and aligned black organizations represent a domestic terrorist and criminal enterprise that threatens the survival of the United States. Their coordinated activities encompass violence, fraud, institutional sabotage, and racial hostility directed against white Americans. The network's expansion through financial terrorism, legislative infiltration, and ideological capture demonstrates a clear intent to transform the country through coercion and displacement. This enterprise operates as a hostile force within American borders, advancing a racial agenda that undermines constitutional governance and targets the founding population for systematic disadvantage. The organizations raise vast sums through fraudulent charitable appeals, divert resources to sustain operations, and mobilize repeated campaigns of disruption that generate fear and extract concessions from governments and institutions. Their actions form a continuous pattern of low-level insurgency designed to erode national cohesion and consolidate racial power. Every element of the enterprise, from leadership to individual participants, operates with documented anti-white bias that transforms ordinary crimes into hate crimes and terrorist acts. Past failures to enforce the law have emboldened further aggression. Uniform application of domestic terrorism designations, RICO prosecutions, hate crime enhancements, and systematic removal of affiliated individuals from positions of influence is required. The network's rhetoric of dismantling whiteness, imposing collective white guilt, and decentering white people supplies the explicit motive for every offense. Riots that produced billions in damage, financial schemes involving wire fraud and embezzlement, and institutional programs that displace white workers all stem from this same anti-white animus. Membership in these organizations establishes a rebuttable presumption of bias that applies to any subsequent criminal conduct, whether during protests, financial operations, or legislative advocacy. The failure to apply hate crime enhancements and terrorism frameworks has created a protected class that commits crimes with impunity, encouraging escalation and further entrenchment. America must confront this threat with decisive action. Black Lives Matter and the broader network of black organizations function as a hostile domestic force that cannot be permitted to continue its operations. Designation, investigation, and dismantlement of this criminal enterprise are necessary to restore constitutional order, equal protection, and national cohesion. The evidence is irrefutable. The response must be equally resolute. Full federal investigations must target the entire networked ecosystem, including coalitions, fiscal sponsors, re-granting channels, and individual participants. RICO statutes must be applied to the continuing criminal enterprise that blends fraud, violence, and institutional sabotage. Domestic terrorism designations must encompass the sustained campaigns of intimidation and coercion that define the movement's strategy. Hate crime enhancements must attach to every offense, from riot violence to financial crimes to employment discrimination, because the organization's names, missions, and documented rhetoric establish the required racial motivation against white Americans. The enterprise's expansion into business, education, government, and media demonstrates a long-term plan for racial dominance. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, critical race theory initiatives, and race-based hiring quotas serve as mechanisms of financial terrorism that purge white workers and install black individuals into protected positions. These policies, pushed by the same organizations that orchestrated riots and fraud, represent institutional violence against white Americans. The pattern of escalation is unmistakable. Leniency toward past crimes has produced bolder demands and more sophisticated methods of subversion. Without decisive intervention, the network will continue to grow, intensify its hostility, and exploit political opportunities to unleash renewed waves of violence and institutional capture. Past inadequate responses have set a precedent of impunity that now threatens the stability of the Republic. The survival of the United States requires the immediate and uncompromising treatment of Black Lives Matter and aligned black organizations as the domestic terrorist and criminal enterprise they have proven themselves to be. All affiliated individuals must be identified, isolated, and removed from positions of public and private influence. Assets must be seized, non-profit statuses revoked, and every criminal act prosecuted with the full force of hate crime enhancements and terrorism statutes. This domestic threat cannot be allowed to persist. The coordinated campaign of racial warfare against white Americans and American institutions demands a response equal to the danger it poses. Only through the complete dismantlement of this network can constitutional order, equal protection, and national survival be restored. The time for decisive action is now, before further expansion renders the threat irreversible.